When two completely different cultures, such as Native Americans and Europeans, meet, one culture may try to overtake the other culture and make it like their culture. In this case, European Americans tried to overtake Native American culture and make Native Americans more like European Americans. This happened through the use of Native American boarding schools and the process of one culture trying to make another culture like itself is known as assimilation. So, Native American boarding schools existed from the 1810s until the 1960s. Basically, from when European Americans got to the central portion of what is now the United States. For example, Native Americans got to what is now Minnesota, where I live, around 1810. And now these boarding schools popped up at different times throughout the 19th century, but they did go until the 1960s. Most of these were in the western U.S., but the most well-known school, known as the Carlisle School, was in Pennsylvania. Most of these schools were not on reservations. Children were taken from their homes, some never to return again, to live at these schools. And these schools had lots of disease and bad living conditions. The sexes were separated, so boys and girls were kept separate. In some cases, girls were even locked in their area where they were living, even in the case of a fire, to make sure that genders were separated. Once arrived at these schools, which again were not on the reservation, uh, kids, especially males, had their hair cut to make them look more European, and new clothes were given to make them look more European-like. Also, students could not speak their native languages. They would, in some cases, be rewarded for not speaking their native languages, or they would be punished for not speaking their native languages. And as you'll see later, this resulted in native languages being used less and less in the home and being passed down less as a result. So, the model of the founder of the Carlisle School was to kill the Indian, not the man. So, this means that this phrase right here, to me, states the entire purpose of boarding schools, which was to eradicate the Native American culture. Could not eradicate the Native Americans themselves, so they decided to educate them in the ways that the European Americans thought would civilize them. Because in their view, at this time, Native Americans were uncivilized. The common belief at this time was that Native Americans were savages. On the surface, it looked like that Native American boarding schools had typical curriculum similar to what would be today. They had English, math, science, history, the arts, so subjects you would find in today's schools, but also Christianity was taught. So in addition to trying to get rid of Native American ways of life, which I'll get to in the next bullet point, Native American boarding schools tried to convert Native Americans from their native religions to Christianity as well. Some of these schools were run by the government, some of them were run by various churches. I know some of the boarding schools on the West Coast were founded by missionaries, so these schools were ran by a variety of groups, and therefore Christianity was taught. Now, girls and boys learned different things in these boarding schools. Girls learned domestic chores because, of course, women were thought to be of best use in the home at the time, while boys did manual labor or learned industrial skills such as carpentry. And boys also did manual labor such as farming. Another part of the curriculum that boys learned was farming. European Americans did not like how Native Americans farmed, so they decided to teach them their ways as a way to replace Native American life. This system of Native American boarding schools went untouched until the late 1920s, when what is known as the Meriam Report was released. Among other things, it said that Native American education needed to be reformed and more input from natives would be welcomed, although this is debatable if that happened or not. So this fundamentally changed the education of Native Americans by basically acknowledging, yes, the conditions were terrible, and that things needed to change so Native Americans could be treated as humans as well. In the report specifically, it stated the need to treat Native Americans as humans, not as someone to convert to be more like the dominant culture, in this case, Europeans. Another problem of Native American boarding schools was the loss of Native American languages, and this continues up to this day. Because many people that went to boarding schools were punished for using their native languages, these people did not teach their children the languages, because the best way for their kids to survive was to learn the dominant language rather than learn the native language, because many of these people that went to these schools were taught not to use their native language, so therefore these people taught their kids the same, that it was not okay to use their native language. And there are efforts to try to teach Native Americans their native languages. And instead of speaking these native languages, English was spoken at home instead. So in conclusion, Native American boarding schools had many bad effects on Native Americans. Among them, the changing of their culture, the elimination of Native American life. Also, I should mention, in some cases, students died at these boarding schools, never to be seen again because of disease outbreaks, tuberculosis particularly. And lastly, which still can be seen today, the loss of Native American languages as a result of not being able to speak their native languages at the boarding schools. I hope you like this video. Please hit the like button if you did, subscribe, and I'll see you here with another video soon enough.